Ulithi Atoll, November 1944. The sea is a pane of molten silver beneath a tropical dawn. Palm trees line a distant reef, motionless in the humid stillness. Then, from beyond the lagoon's rim, a shape emerges. A procession of massive steel hulls, low and hollow, each hundreds of feet long. They move slowly, chained together, guided by tugs like ants, pulling the skeleton of a leviathan. On deck, men in khaki wipe the salt from their faces. Welding torches flash in the half-light, blue sparks reflected on sweating skin. Each section bears a number, ABSD1, Section A through G, and as they lock into place, a floating colossus begins to form. By nightfall, the sea will cradle something that had never existed before. A dry dock large enough to lift an American battleship, built not in a harbor, but here, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. In a few weeks, this steel cathedral will receive its first wounded giant, a warship limping from the fire of Leyte Gulf, desperate for repair. It will mark a new frontier in warfare, when an entire industrial revolution learned to float. The question is, how did America build such a thing? In 1942, the Pacific Ocean was the largest battlefield in history. From the Aleutians to the Coral Sea, more than 60 million square miles of salt water separated American factories from the front lines. The U.S. Navy, still recovering from the shock of Pearl Harbor, now faced a problem far greater than any fleet engagement: distance. Every mile won from Japan stretched the supply lines thinner. Battleships, carriers, and cruisers fought across endless expanses, hundreds of miles from the nearest friendly port. When a ship took damage, the choices were grim: limp home across the ocean or be abandoned. Pearl Harbor's dry docks could hold only a handful of capital ships. On the west coast, the yards of Mare Island, Puget Sound, and San Francisco already overflowed with construction. New Essex-class carriers, destroyers, and landing craft. There was no space for emergency repairs. By late 1942, the Navy's Bureau of Ships began to calculate the losses. Each damaged vessel forced to return to the mainland meant months of downtime. Every day out of combat was another day the fleet fought blind. The solution could not be to build more ports. It would take years. Instead, the Navy needed to move the ports themselves. At first, the idea sounded impossible. A dry dock is among the largest fixed structures on Earth. Concrete, cranes, pumps, power, all permanent, all dependent on stable foundations. But in the Pacific, there were no foundations, only coral, water, and war. Still, the Navy had one secret advantage: engineers who refused to think small. Since 1940, American shipyards had been experimenting with sectional floating dry docks, massive steel pontoons that could be joined together to form a lifting platform of any desired length. Each section was hollow, with ballast tanks and pumps to raise or lower its buoyancy. Welded sidewalls rose like fortress walls, sealing out the sea. With enough sections linked end to end, the system could cradle even the largest warships afloat. By the time of the Guadalcanal campaign in late 1942, smaller versions were already working miracles. Auxiliary repair docks, ARDs, compact, self-contained versions, were servicing destroyers and submarines at Noumea and Espiritu Santo. Their success proved a new concept: repair the fleet forward, not backward. Rear Admiral Samuel M. Robinson, head of the Bureau of Ships, took note. He understood the scale of what was required: something that could lift 70,000 tons of steel deep in enemy waters without touching land. The idea of a large auxiliary floating dry dock, abbreviated AFDB or ABSD, moved from drawing board to emergency priority. Design work began in 1943. Each section would be about 93 feet wide, 256 feet long and 75 feet deep, weighing nearly 10,000 tons. 10 sections together could lift a battleship clear of the water. Built from steel at shipyards along the Gulf and East coasts, the sections would be towed, one by one, across the Panama Canal, through submarine-infested waters to the far Pacific. The industrial challenge was staggering. Each segment had to be seaworthy, stable, and self-powered with pumps and generators. Once assembled, the dock would require its own crew, its own command structure, even its own postal address. But the Navy's logistical doctrine was shifting. Admiral Chester Nimitz envisioned a floating base system, a chain of mobile depots, fuel ships, ammunition barges, and repair docks leapfrogging westward behind the fleet. The floating dry dock was to be its centerpiece. By mid-1943, contracts were issued. American Bridge Company, Chicago Bridge and Iron, and Bethlehem Steel began cutting steel. Over 150,000 tons of plate, thousands of valves, pumps, and engines, all to construct a fleet of floating docks. Workers on the home front labored in secrecy and speed. These were not glamorous ships. There would be no headlines for them. Yet the men and women riveting their seams were unknowingly building the stage on which the Pacific War would turn. Each dock would bear a number, ABSD-1 through ABSD-6, later renamed AFDBs, and each would sail thousands of miles from the shipyard to a lagoon, waiting for the fleet's wounded. By late 1943, the first sections slid into the water. The journey west was about to begin. A voyage that would test the limits of steel, seamanship, and imagination. They left in convoys, towed by tugs and accompanied by escort vessels, immense rectangular barges of steel, each with its own name, number, and destination. From Mobile, New Orleans, and Portland, they crept down the coastlines and through the Panama Canal, bound for the Pacific. Each section moved at the pace of a man walking. Crossing 10,000 miles of ocean at 6 knots meant weeks of exposure to weather and submarine threat. The men aboard the towing ships remembered the sight. Flat, gray walls stretching into the horizon, their rivets glinting in the sun. The U.S. Navy's service squadrons were already forming, built on the idea that a modern fleet could live off the sea. Floating fuel depots, tenders, and barracks ships followed the advancing line of islands. With them came the men who would build and operate the docks, the Seabees. Created in early 1942, the U.S. Naval Construction Battalions, quickly known as Seabees, were a hybrid of engineer and soldier. They built airfields under fire, bridges on coral reefs, and docks from jungle timber. Now, they would assemble the largest mobile structures ever made by man. By the spring of 1944, the first of the giant dry dock sections arrived at Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides. There, in a calm tropical anchorage, work began to connect the modules. Seabees used floating cranes, welded hulls, and rigged miles of electrical cabling. Pumps and ballast tanks were tested, and the first trials began. The scale defied imagination. Each section was taller than a 6-story building. Fully assembled, ABSD-1 stretched more than 850 feet in length, nearly the size of an aircraft carrier, and could lift 90,000 tons. For the first time, the United States possessed the ability to repair a battleship without a harbor. The forward strategy now had a physical shape. As the Marines fought through the Solomons and the Gilberts, the Navy's engineers followed, establishing bases where no port had ever existed. The docks became floating cities, with machine shops, foundries, power stations, and hospitals. Crews lived in prefab huts on pontoons. Food and mail arrived by barge. Meanwhile, the Bureau of Ships expanded the program. ABSD-2 and ABSD-3 were assigned to the Central Pacific, destined for Manus Island and later Guam. ABSD-4 would operate at Enewetak Atoll. Each base was chosen for its lagoon, calm, deep, and sheltered by reefs. From the air, these atolls looked like scattered emerald rings. Beneath their blue lagoons, the war's secret infrastructure took root. The modular design proved ingenious. Sections could be detached and towed separately, allowing for assembly anywhere deep enough to anchor. When flooded, the dock sank beneath the surface to let a ship enter. When pumped dry, it lifted the hull completely clear, revealing the torn steel plates and mangled propellers that told stories of combat far from shore. It was industrial might translated into motion. Where Britain and Japan relied on established naval yards, America was building them anew, wherever the fleet demanded. Back home, newspapers rarely mentioned the floating dry docks. To the public, the Pacific War was measured in battles: Tarawa, Saipan, Leyte Gulf. But within Navy circles, the phrase service squadron had become synonymous with endurance. Admirals knew that without maintenance, victory was a mirage. The docks became part of a new pattern of warfare. As islands were captured, bases shifted westward. Each time the front advanced, the Navy packed up its mobile cities and sailed again. Atoll by atoll, the floating dry docks followed, bridging thousands of miles of ocean. By mid-1944, the vision was reality. From Pearl Harbor to Manus to Ulithi and beyond, the Pacific was dotted with workshops, cranes, and foundries, all afloat. Ships no longer had to limp home. They could be repaired within days and sent back into battle. The idea that had once seemed absurd, a dry dock in the middle of the ocean, was now the backbone of an empire at sea. Soon, the war would put these titans to the test. At Ulithi, the air smelled of diesel and salt. Seabees worked shirtless in the tropical heat, torches hissing as they joined plates the size of train cars. Around them floated a city of anchored ships, tankers, repair barges, ammunition carriers, the invisible machinery that kept the Pacific War alive. Many of the men had come from shipyards, farms, and steel mills back home. Their average age was 37, older than the Marines they supported. They slept in cots above ballast tanks and labored 18-hour days. The welders' goggles left pale rings around sunburned eyes. Their ears rang from the hammering of rivets against steel. They weren't fighting the enemy directly. Their war was against distance, corrosion, and exhaustion. Every beam they welded, every pump they tested, was a link in the chain that kept American ships from vanishing into the sea. When the first wounded battleship, USS Pennsylvania, eased into ABSD-2's open gate, the men watched in silence. Beneath the hull hung torn armor plates and twisted screws. The ship had survived bombs and torpedoes, but it would survive again only because these anonymous workers made the impossible real. The Seabees motto said it best: "We build, we fight, but here, in this floating fortress of steel." They built so others could fight. Before 1943, every major repair meant a round trip of up to 12,000 miles from the combat zone to a mainland shipyard. The loss of time was catastrophic. A carrier struck at Midway might be out of action for 6 months, long enough for an entire campaign to shift without her. The introduction of the large auxiliary floating dry dock changed everything. The U.S. Navy could now maintain a continuous offensive tempo. Damaged ships no longer left the theater. They were patched, refitted, and rearmed within weeks. This capability became critical after the battles of Saipan, Philippine Sea, and Leyte Gulf. While Japan struggled to replace even a single carrier, the U.S. Navy repaired its giants in hidden lagoons and sent them back to fight again. It was warfare sustained by logistics, not luck. At Ulithi Atoll, ABSD-2 and ABSD-3 became the beating heart of the fleet. Destroyers rotated through for propeller replacements. Cruisers had their hulls patched and guns recalibrated. Even battleships, their armor rent by kamikaze strikes, were lifted from the water, repaired, and redeployed, all within sight of palm trees and coral reefs. This forward repair network gave Admiral Nimitz what no fleet commander had ever possessed: permanence in motion. The Pacific no longer consumed ships, it recycled them. And behind every victory from Iwo Jima to Okinawa, the silent work of those floating steel platforms made it possible. A floating dry dock was not a single vessel, but a modular system. Each section, 10,000 tons of steel, contained ballast tanks, pumps, generators, and control rooms. The sections were joined by massive steel pins and watertight gaskets. When assembled, they created a hollow platform that could be ballasted down until its deck sank beneath the surface. A ship entered under her own power, guided by tugs. Once aligned, valves closed and pumps roared to life. Water poured from the tanks, and the entire dock, sometimes weighing over 100,000 tons, slowly rose, lifting the warship with it. Within hours, a battleship that once floated in open sea now rested high and dry, her entire underbelly exposed. Crewmen could walk beneath the hull, inspecting damage invisible to the eye at sea. Giant cranes swung overhead, hoisting new propeller shafts or hull plates. Steam lines, electrical cables, and repair hoses snaked across the deck like arteries. The process was delicate. An uneven lift could twist the hull of a ship. The dockmasters relied on precise gauges and synchronized pumps, adjusting ballast levels by inches. Everything, power, water, lighting, machinery, was self-contained. The dock could operate autonomously for weeks, supplied only by fuel and provisions. In its scale and sophistication, it was an industrial miracle, a moving city of steel and pressure gauges. The floating dry dock was not just a tool, it was an idea made real, that the sea itself could serve as America's workshop. And in the middle of that vast ocean, where warships rose from the water like resurrected giants, the boundaries between shore and shipyard disappeared. At the center of the Pacific campaign stood a handful of minds who saw beyond battle maps. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz understood that mobility would decide the war. His strategy depended not just on fleets, but on the invisible web that kept them alive. When Nimitz reviewed the Bureau of Ships' proposal for modular dry docks in 1943, he grasped its significance instantly. Logistics are as decisive as gunfire. He and officers like Rear Admiral Samuel M. Robinson and Vice Admiral William R. Carter, head of Service Force, Pacific Fleet, transformed the abstract into doctrine. They envisioned the Navy as a floating organism, able to feed, refuel, and repair itself anywhere on the planet. Under their command, service squadrons became self-contained worlds, squadrons of tenders, barges, machine shops, and repair docks capable of rebuilding a fleet thousands of miles from land. Carter's Service Squadron 10, based at Ulithi, became legendary. Its organization rivaled that of a major port, more than 600 vessels and 30,000 men. Amid them, the floating dry docks stood like temples of steel, vast, silent, indispensable. Leadership in this theater meant more than tactics. It meant trust in engineers, planners, and workers unseen by the public. Across the Pacific, Japan watched with disbelief. Its dockyards lay deep inside the home islands. Every major Japanese ship damaged in battle faced a cruel journey home. Destroyers struck at Guadalcanal were scuttled rather than salvaged. By 1944, the gap had become fatal. American carriers could sustain near-constant operations because damaged vessels returned to service within weeks. Japan, by contrast, lost irreplaceable hulls from the air. Japanese reconnaissance sometimes spotted Ulithi or Manus. Harbors conjured from nothing. Thousands of ships, cranes, and smokestacks rising from lagoons where no city existed. Kamikaze pilots, in their final sorties, were ordered to strike fleet repair areas, But the ocean's immensity made those coordinates guesswork. The floating dry docks survived the war virtually untouched. In this unseen contest of endurance, Japan never stood a chance. America's floating dry docks were more than machines. They were proof that industrial war had moved beyond geography. Every triumph carried a shadow. Behind the gleaming hulls and efficient logistics lay a human toll measured not in glory, but in fatigue and sacrifice. The workers who built the docks labored under relentless schedules. Women welders worked beside veterans too old for combat. Accidents were frequent. At sea, the Seabees lived under constant strain. In tropical anchorages, malaria and dysentery claimed almost as many days as enemy action. When typhoons swept across the islands, entire docks had to be flooded to keep them from capsizing. Each repair came with risk. Divers worked in oil-slicked water under battleship hulls, scraping barnacles and welding ruptured plates. Yet few complained. They understood their work meant lives saved. By 1944, these human, tactical, technological, strategic, and moral forces converged into a single moment of reckoning. Ulithi Atoll, November 1944. The Battle of Leyte Gulf had ended. Victory at a cost. The battleship USS Pennsylvania limped into the lagoon, her hull battered and leaking. But this time she would not sail home. She would be lifted by ABSD-2, a structure of 10 joined steel sections floating in open ocean. Tugs guided her in. Pumps roared. The dock rose from the sea, lifting 31,000 tons of battleship into air. Men swarmed her hull, sparks falling into dark water. For days, they worked without rest, repairing armor, replacing screws, sealing plates. In weeks, she was ready for battle again. The floating dock had proven itself. Through 1944 and 1945, damaged ships converged on Ulithi. Cruisers, destroyers, carriers, each lifted, repaired, and reborn. Then came the storms. Typhoons swept across the Pacific, waves higher than the dock's walls. Crews ballasted down the docks, flooding them to survive. When the storms passed, the docks rose again, scarred but unbroken. Soon another wounded battleship arrived, USS Mississippi. Her hull burned from kamikaze attack. Once again, the dock rose, lifting her into safety. Sparks lit the night as repairs continued around the clock. Within days, she too sailed back to war. By war's end, the docks had repaired over 400 ships. They turned Ulithi into the largest harbor on Earth, though it had no land at all. When Japan surrendered, the Pacific grew quiet. The docks stood empty, their pumps silent. In reports and ledgers, their triumph was measured in numbers: 15 battleships, 20 cruisers, 40 carriers, and hundreds of smaller ships repaired. Historians later wrote that without them, the war might have lasted 6 to 9 months longer. When peace came, their crews quietly dismantled them section by section, towing them home across the same waters they had conquered. Some remained as permanent bases, others were scrapped or forgotten. Their steel frames outlasted the war, echoing a truth deeper than strategy: that the power to rebuild is the power to win. Even in the atomic age, their logic endured. Mobile docks were repurposed for the Cold War, servicing submarines and carriers from Guam to the Arctic. Some became breakwaters, others rusted in forgotten bays, coral growing through their ribs. The ocean erased their presence, but not their legacy. Every modern naval base, every offshore platform, every forward-deployed repair ship carries their DNA. In the quiet after war, those who had built and manned them remembered the sound of pumps, the sting of salt, the glow of welding arcs beneath tropical rain. They had not fought with guns, but they had held the sea itself in balance. When the sun set over Ulithi for the last time, The lagoon was still, cranes motionless, decks empty, the vast steel docks floating like monuments to human will. The ocean had reclaimed its calm, but beneath its surface lay the memory of an age when men turned industry into endurance. The Pacific War ended with mushroom clouds and treaties, but beneath those symbols lay something quieter. An engineering revolution born of necessity. The floating dry docks were never meant to be remembered. They had no names etched on memorials, no battles emblazoned on campaign ribbons. Yet, in their hollow steel frames, the United States found the secret to endurance, the ability to restore strength faster than it could be broken. When historians write of victory, they speak of admirals and armies, of tactics and courage. But the true heart of modern war beats in the rhythm of machines, in welders' arcs, in pumps and valves, in the hum of engines working unseen. From the forges of Pennsylvania to the coral lagoons of Micronesia, a single idea crossed oceans, that technology could make geography irrelevant. The floating dry docks turned empty water into infrastructure, proving that human resolve could make even the Pacific manageable. Today, every carrier strike group, every forward naval base, every mobile repair platform owes its lineage to those floating walls of steel. They were the unheralded revolutionaries of the sea, industrial cathedrals that carried the war's most sacred act, the will to endure. The ocean remembers none of it. The waves have reclaimed the places where men once bent metal and defied storms. But if you sail across those calm waters and look down through the blue, you might imagine them still there, the docks that lifted giants from the deep, and proved that even in war, the highest form of power is the power to rebuild.